All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into the world of IAM. That's AWS Identity and Access Management. Um, Whether you're, cramming for a cert exam, building some cool stuff in the cloud, or just curious about how it all works, IAM is kind of the gatekeeper, right?
Yeah.
In the cloud, it's not enough to just build things. Got to control them too.
Exactly. It's like imagine the Wild West, but with your data.
Mm.
Anyone can access anything.
Yikes. Not a pretty picture.
Yeah, total chaos. And that's where AWS IAM steps in. It's the sheriff, lays down the law about who gets in, where they can go, what they're allowed to do.
Okay, so Sheriff, break it down for us. Why should our listeners care about this IAM thing?
Well, first off, think about this. You wake up one morning and your entire cloud infrastructure is gone. Poof. Someone got their hands on the wrong credentials.
Okay, now that's a nightmare I don't want to have.
Right. That's exactly the kind of disaster IAM prevents. Your first line of defense against unauthorized access, data breaches, all that bad stuff.
Makes sense. But it's not just about preventing those big blowups, right? It's also about keeping things organized and running smoothly.
Oh, absolutely. Think of it like a well-run company. You wouldn't want the intern peeking at the CEO's financial reports.
Probably not a good idea.
Exactly. IAM lets you set up this whole hierarchy of permissions. So each person, each user, gets exactly the access they need, nothing more. We call it least privilege. Super important concept. We'll definitely dig into that more later on.
I'm already seeing how this is, more than just security. It's like setting up the org chart for your whole cloud operation.
Yeah.
And for this deep dive, we've got some awesome resources lined up. We've got snippets from a hands-on YouTube lab where, people actually get to play with IEM settings.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, really cool. We've got some clear explanations to make sure we get the key concepts, and we're even going to get into the nitty-gritty details for those who really want to get their hands dirty.
Love it. Well, let's get started then. Shall we break down those core components of IAM? Users, groups, roles, and policies. Those are the big ones.
Sounds good. Let's start with users. Are those like, individual accounts, kind of like on your computer?
Exactly. Each person or even each application, anything that needs to interact with your AWS environment needs its own AWS identity, right? Just like your login for your laptop.
Okay, so we've got our individuals covered. What about teams? That's where groups come in, I guess.
You got it. Think of it like departments in a company. Instead of like granting permissions to each individual person one by one, you create groups, developers, admins, marketing, whatever makes sense, and then you assign permissions to the whole group. Saves a ton of time and hassle.
Right, efficiency is key. Now, what about those situations where maybe you need to give someone temporary access? Or what if an application needs access to something specific for a little while?
Yeah.
That's where roles fit in.
Right. Great question. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Roles are like these temporary badges. You can hand them out to users or even applications to let them do specific things in your AWS environment.
I'm liking this.
Yeah, they're super powerful because they let you grant that very specific level of access just for a limited time without having to create a whole new user account.
So it's about minimizing risk. If you've got a contractor working on a project, they need access to a specific database for a week. You give them a role for that week, and then it just automatically expires.
Yeah.
No need to remember to go back and revoke those permissions later.
Exactly. It's like giving them a key to just one room in your house instead of handing over the keys to the whole place.
Makes perfect sense. So we've got users, groups, and roles. But how do we actually define what each of these can or can't do? That's where policies come in, right? The rules of the road, so to speak.
You got it. Policies are the rule book for your AWS world. They're written in a language called JSON, but don't worry, we won't get too technical with that. The important thing is these policies spell out exactly which actions are allowed or denied for each user, group, or role. It's all about that fine-grained control.
Okay, so it's not just about saying, hey, you have access to S3, our storage service. You can get way more specific and say, you can upload files to this bucket, but you can't delete anything. That kind of detail, right?
Exactly. You can look, but you can't touch. And that level of control, that's what makes IAM so powerful for managing security and really locking down those valuable resources in your cloud.
Right, so we've got the core components, users, groups, roles, and policies. These feel like, I don't know, like the foundational building blocks of a well-structured AWS environment.
Absolutely. Understanding these core concepts, it's like learning the alphabet of AWS security. Once you've got those down, you're well on your way to mastering the language of IAM.
And to really see how this all comes together, let's take a look at that hands-on YouTube lab we talked about earlier. And a great way to visualize how these different parts actually work together.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So this lab dives into two key services, EC2, which is all about virtual servers, and S3, the go-to for storing data in the cloud. And they walk through setting up different levels of access so you can really see what happens when someone tries to do something they're not supposed to.
It's all about that aha moment, right?
Exactly. It's one thing to hear about policies and permissions, but it's a whole other thing to actually see it play out, to experience that, access denied message when your policy says, nope, not allowed.
That's where the rubber meets the road, right? You
Yeah.
get that hands-on experience of what those access restrictions actually mean.
Okay, so that lab sounds like a pretty awesome way to demystify some of this stuff. We've got the basics down, a real-world example to help us visualize it, and now, frankly, I'm kind of itching to dig into some more of those details.
Well, hold on tight, because that's exactly where we're headed next. Let's dive into some of the finer points of IAM, the best practices that'll help you truly master this thing and secure your AWS kingdom like a pro. All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready to dig a little deeper into the world of IAM?
Absolutely. Feeling like a digital archaeologist here, uncovering all these hidden security treasures.
Love it. So today we're going to focus on providing secure access, but doing it at a right time in the right way. Think of it like, I don't know, like a master key system for your AWS environment. You control who gets what key and for how long.
Okay, I like this analogy, but how does this whole master key thing actually work in practice?
Well, we talked about those access keys, right? Those are like your permanent keys, grant long-term access. But sometimes you need something more temporary, like a visitor pass. That's where temporary security credentials come in.
So it's like issuing a temporary badge for someone who needs access to a certain area just for a limited time.
Hmm.
Once that badge expires, no more access. Keeps things nice and tidy.
Exactly. It's all about minimizing risk, making sure that access is only granted when absolutely necessary. And the service that makes all this magic happen, it's called AWS Security Token Service, STS for short.
STS. Sounds powerful. So if I'm getting this right, STS is like the key master, right? Creating and handing out these temporary credentials. When would you actually use something like this?
Good question. Imagine you've got an application, right, running on an EC2 instance, and it needs to access data in an S3 bucket. Now, if you hard code those long-term access keys right into your application code, well, that's a big no-no. Huge security risk. It's like writing your passwords on a sticky note and slapping it on your monitor for everyone to see.
Yeah, not exactly best practice.
Not at all. So instead of doing that, you use STS, generate temporary credentials that are, very specifically limited. They can only access that one S3 bucket, and they expire after a short time. So even if someone gets their hands on those credentials, the damage they can do is limited. We call it minimizing the blast radius.
Okay, I'm starting to see how useful this can be. But this isn't just for applications, right? This temporary credential system, it can be helpful for managing human users too.
You're absolutely right. Let's say you've got a contractor needs access to a specific AWS resource, but just for a short period. Instead of setting up a whole IAM user account for them, which would be a pain, you just use STS, issue them those temporary credentials. They automatically expire when the contract is done.
So it's all about like need to know, need to use, makes sense. And what's cool is that these temporary credentials can be used by all sorts of things, not just users or applications.
Right. Even AWS services themselves can use those temporary credentials, access resources securely in a very controlled way. It's like creating a system where everyone has the right level of access, but only when they actually need it.
This is really cool. But as much as I love the idea of these temporary credentials, I got to ask, what happens when you need to grant access across multiple AWS accounts? That sounds like it could get pretty hairy.
You're not wrong. Managing multiple accounts can be a bit of a challenge, but AWS has got you covered. It's called cross-account access, and guess what? It uses STS.
Wait, so I can use STS to give users in one account permission to access resources in a totally different account, like
Right.
having a key that unlocks doors in different buildings.
Exactly. It's a fantastic way to streamline how you manage your accounts and keep things neatly separated. You might have your development account, your testing account, your production account. With cross-account access, you can let those developers in the development account deploy code to the testing environment, but without giving them access to that sensitive production data.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's like setting up a series of checkpoints to make sure only the right people can get through. But, talking about multiple accounts, it's hitting me that managing IAM at a larger scale with a lot of moving parts, that could get really complicated.
Yeah, you're not wrong. As organizations grow, and their cloud footprint expands, keeping track of all those users, groups, policies, it can become a real headache. Imagine trying to handle like thousands of users manually, each with their own set of permissions. It would be pure chaos.
Talk about a migraine. So how do companies actually tackle this? How do they keep things under control when they're dealing with IAM at that scale?
Well, there's a service called AWS Organizations. Think of it like mission control for all your AWS accounts. You can set high-level policies and security settings that apply to all the individual accounts under it.
So it's like establishing a central authority, right? They set the ground rules for all the different departments or teams within the organization.
Exactly. It's about setting that baseline level of security, that governance across your entire AWS environment. Keeps things consistent, keeps everyone on the same page, no matter how many accounts you're juggling.
Okay, that definitely makes managing IAM at scale seem a bit less daunting. But I gotta say, I still feel like there's a lot of manual work involved. Even with a centralized system, you're still creating users, assigning permissions, updating policies. There's got to be a better way, right?
Oh, there absolutely is. Exactly. It's about creating a process that's repeatable, that you can scale up. And if you want to take automation even further, you can use services like AWS Lambda. That lets you run code without having to manage any servers. You can create Lambda functions that automatically rotate access keys, generate those temporary credentials we talked about, even provision new users based on specific conditions. The sky's the limit.
Wow, automation is starting to sound like a real game changer. It's like having a team of tireless robots working 24/7 to make sure everything is set up perfectly and securely.
And the best part, it frees up your time so you can focus on the bigger picture. Defining those security best practices, auditing permissions, making sure you're compliant with all the regulations, working smarter, not harder. That's the key.
Okay, I'm sold on this automation revolution. But as we wrap up this part of our IAM deep dive, it's important to remember that even with all these fancy tools and services, security is ultimately a shared responsibility.
You're absolutely right. AWS provides all the building blocks, but it's up to each organization to put those pieces together in a way that works for them, that meets their specific needs.
It's about taking ownership of your cloud security, creating a culture of security within your organization. That means more than just implementing the right technical controls, right? You need to educate your team, make sure everyone's thinking about security, encourage everyone to be proactive.
It's about building a culture where security is not just an afterthought, it's baked into everything you do in the cloud.
Welcome back, cloud security fans. We've journeyed through the core of IAM, explored some pretty cool automation tools, and talked about building that security-first mindset. Now, in this final stretch of our deep dive, let's push the boundaries a bit. Explore some of those advanced IAM concepts that can really elevate your cloud security game.
Sounds good to me. We're going deep into fine-grained control, contextual awareness, even serverless security. It's all about adding layers of, well, let's call it intelligence to your IAM policies so you can tailor access with laser precision.
All right, I'm intrigued. Let's hear it.
Okay, let's start with ABAC. Attribute-based access control. Think of it as the next step in the evolution of IAM policies. You're moving beyond those basic identity-based rules and embracing the power of context.
Okay, context sounds interesting, but I'm not sure I fully get it. What does that actually mean in the world of IAM?
Sure. With ABAC, you can factor in all sorts of things when you're deciding who gets access to what. We're talking about things like a user's department, their job title, their location, even the time of day. You can also look at the resource itself, what environment it belongs to, development, testing, production, sensitivity level, tags, all that good stuff.
So instead of just saying, Bob from marketing can access this S3 bucket,
Eh,
I could say, anyone from marketing with a senior analyst title can access this specific bucket, but only during business hours and only from our corporate network. Something like that.
You nailed it. That's the level of granularity we're talking about with ABSC. You can create policies that adapt to the ever-changing nature of your cloud environment.
It's like a security system that can adjust its level of, I don't know, vigilance based on a whole bunch of different factors, instead of just relying on those static rules. I can definitely see how this would be super valuable for organizations with complex security needs.
Absolutely. And while we're talking about context, there's another piece that's often overlooked. Network location. Where a request comes from can be a really important piece of information when you're making those access decisions.
Makes sense. If someone's trying to access sensitive data from, like, a public Wi-Fi network at a coffee shop, that should probably raise a red flag.
Exactly. And that's where VPC endpoints come in. They let you set up these private connections between your VPC, your virtual private cloud, which is like your own little network within AWS, and those supported AWS services. It keeps all your traffic within the AWS network away from the wild west of the public internet.
So it's like a secure tunnel, right, between your VPC and the AWS services you need to access. No need to risk exposing things out on the open internet.
Right. And the really cool part is that you can actually use VPC endpoints to restrict access based on the source VPC. So, for example, you could set up a policy that says only requests coming from our corporate VPC can get into this S3 bucket.
Ah, so another layer of security. Making sure that access is only granted from trusted network locations. It's like a VIP entrance.
Yeah.
Only lets you in if you're coming from a certain part of the city.
Nice analogy. And to take that contextual awareness even further, AWS gives you CloudTrail. Think of it like a security camera, constantly recording every API call made in your AWS account. Logs who did what, when they did it, and where they did it from. Super useful for troubleshooting, security analysis, compliance audits, all that.
So it's like a detailed log of every single action taken within your AWS environment. That's got to be a gold mine of information for security folks.
You bet. If you need to investigate something suspicious, prove that you're meeting those compliance requirements, or just understand how your AWS resources are being used, CloudTrail is your best friend.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in terms of, that granular control and contextual awareness. But there's one more piece of the puzzle I'm curious about: serverless security. Serverless architectures are becoming super popular these days, and I'm wondering how IAM fits into that world.
Yeah, great question. Serverless is definitely changing the game, and IAM is absolutely critical for securing those architectures. Now, when we say serverless, we're often talking about AWS Lambda, that service that lets you run code without having to worry about servers.
All right, Lambda, write your code, upload it, and AWS handles the rest. Super efficient, super scalable.
And what's awesome is that Lambda works hand in hand with IAM. See, Lambda functions, they don't have a fixed identity like a traditional server. They assume an IAM role. That role defines what they're allowed to do.
So it's like each Lambda function gets its own security clearance, right? Tailored to whatever specific task it needs to perform. Kind of like assigning different roles to different team members, each with their own responsibilities and access privileges.
You got it. And it gets even cooler. Those permissions can actually be refined based on the context of how that function is invoked. So for instance, you could give a Lambda function access to a specific S3 bucket, but only if it's triggered by an event from a certain CloudWatch event rule.
So it's not just what the Lambda function can do, but when and under what conditions it can do those things.
Right.
Like giving the function instructions that say, you can only use this key to open this door if you hear this specific knock.
Perfect analogy. It's
Yeah.
all about those layers, Contextual awareness, fine-grained control, makes those serverless applications as secure as they can be.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground in this IAM deep dive. We explored those foundational pieces, dug into some advanced concepts like ABAC and VPC endpoints, even touched on the world of serverless security.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey through the constantly evolving landscape of IAM. And as we wrap things up, I just want to emphasize that, security is not a one-time thing. It's not a destination. It's an ongoing journey.
Couldn't agree more. It's a process of always getting better, adapting to new threats, embracing those new technologies, and just constantly fine-tuning your security posture.
And as you're on that journey, remember to use all those great resources that AWS provides. Stay updated on the latest best practices, and never underestimate the power of automation and that contextual awareness.
And most importantly, build that culture of security within your organization. Empower your teams to be proactive, to be vigilant, to be, well, maybe a little bit obsessed with keeping your AWS cloud a secure and successful ecosystem.
Well said. It's been awesome exploring the world of IMM with you, and we hope this deep dive has given you the tools and knowledge you need to build a secure and resilient cloud environment.
Until next time, stay curious, stay secure, and keep those cloud adventures going strong.